Hello, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Welcome. And particularly welcome to Daniel. So this evening isn't about me, it's a conversation between me and Daniel, and he's also sharing some music with us, which he finds particularly interesting or appropriate. So I thought, I've known Daniel for a very long time, probably more than 30 years in various capacities. And but I thought, despite that, it would be a good idea to do a bit of research before I decided to talk to you in public. So I had a look at Daniel's website, and it was one of the most eclectic websites I've ever been on, in terms of the range of interests and activities, from editing legal journals, training lawyers and drafting officers in Myanmar, Northern Ireland and Malaysia, and some very emotive clips of the davening from the Yom Naraim, which have me singing along this afternoon. Kids thought I was absolutely mad, would be familiar to very many of you. So let's start right at the very beginning. Daniel, you grew up in Dunstan Road, yeah? Mm. Okay, so what was it like when you were growing up? Quite a long time ago. What was it like in Shul then?
Dunstan Road was a really wonderful community. It was the architecture made an enormous impression on me as a very young, very small child, sitting in the shul next to my father, and the feeling of size. There was an awe. You felt awe-inspired. There was a dignity to it. During Kedusha, there were little red velvet ropes that were put across the aisle so that nobody should come in or out during Kedusha. It was very formal, very dignified, and it had a real sense of respect and solemnity. And that's I think what stays with me. And I think it's a fantastic foundation for children to grow up with a sense of shul is a place where you feel you are in the presence of greatness. And it isn't a place to run around, but it isn't a place to chat. It's a place where we might not come very often, but when we do, we're in the presence of God. And I think it was it was a fantastic foundation from that respect. And I think not just Dunstan Road, I think many shuls have lost that. It's great that people are more at home in shul in some ways. There are more people. In those days, there were probably one or two Lovim Nesroigim on Sukkot, very, very few, one or two. Today you can't move for the Lovim Nesroigim, but we've lost what we've gained in familiarity. We have lost through familiarity. In those days, I remember a lot of people who came to shul were not particularly observant. There was quite a taste for driving to shul and parking around the corner, and I suspect many of the people who did that had no idea that the respect, the kvod shamayim, the respect for God that they were showing by parking around the corner. Yeah, I know it's not quite the right thing, so I'll park in the corner. I don't want it in your face, as it were. That respect was their mafteach la'olam ha'emes. That is the key to the kind of humility that I think we all need to aspire to on Yom Adin. So that kind of feeling for we need to be humble in the face of God. This is a place of solemnity, of awe-inspiring. That I think was a fantastic foundation, and I think many shuls have lost that. I was thinking one of the years when I came to Dunstan Road to daven on the Yom Naraim, I was looking around and I was finding it slightly difficult to concentrate because there were two people sitting quite near me, quite near the bimah, and they were chatting. Maybe, when the sun is not necessarily the ideal time to have a chat, but they were chatting. All right, it's not the end of the world. But I was looking at them, and I was thinking they were both highly involved in the shul. They were both people who were very.
It wasn't the husband, was it?
and I mean, observant people. And I was thinking to myself, people who were that involved in the community when I grew up would not probably wouldn't have been observant, but they would not have chatted during the Nusana Take. So it was a wonderful place, and it still is a wonderful place. Some of the things that I think were fantastic then, we've lost a bit, and I dare say there are other things that weren't fantastic then that have got better. But that's my feeling. You want to know what I feel like when I look back on Dunstan Road? It was that Kvod Shamayim, respect. We're in a special building, and something extraordinary is happening here.
Okay. When did you first start? Certainly, since I've been here, you've davened for many years. When did you first start davening from the Omid in Dunstan Road or elsewhere? When did you first start doing that?
Oh, for the Omid elsewhere, I've been. I mean, Alan Mays got us together as children, and when it was already the teenage centre, so I was probably 13 years old, and Alan Mays got us together, and he said, before you all start making up your own songs and this, that, and the other, I need to teach you Nusach. So he gathered us together. There were probably 10 of us sitting there, and he taught us basic Nusach Friday night, Shabbos morning, and they said, now you can play, now you can do what you like, now you know the basic Nusach. And I got the habit of davening from that. I used to daven for the Omid at study groups as a teenager, and it's something that I've loved, really loved ever since. And it's, you know, people complain about davening on Yom Noraim. They say, oh, I find it terribly tiring, it's terribly difficult. You try and stop them, it's hard to drag them off the Omid, you know. It's a habit. Once you get the habit, you love it. One's able to express oneself through davening in a special way when one is davening as the Shliach Tzibor, when one has the privilege of leading the congregation. It's a responsibility, and it's a lovely responsibility. It's a great pleasure.
Okay, and it's also obviously it's quite awe-inspiring, and I think that plays out in the first choice of music. Tell us why you chose this piece of music and why you chose this particular version of this piece of music.
Well, it's one of the things I remember about the formality of Dunstan Road in my youth. One week every year was Ajax,
right,
around the Remembrance Sunday, and the banners would come in. They put the banners in the flags, and the banners of the Ajax were put by the Omid. They were held up by the Omid, which Moshe Feinstein says is 100% fine. There's a discussion about whether we can have weapons of war in the shul, and he says these are not weapons of war, they are demonstrations of respect and discipline and order, so that the banners were there, and it was a day that had a special feeling. It really did. Many of the members of the shul, I remember many of them had been officers, non-commissioned officers, commissioned officers, so they would come in their bowler hats, which they would then wear the next day at the cenotaph, and it had a real that was a real occasion every year. And I think remembrance is really something that was a sort of speciality of that generation, partly because obviously the Second World War was so fresh in memories, and I've always taken remembrance seriously as a result of that. And when I started working in Whitehall, I used to enjoy, my office for many years was right over the Horse Guards, the courtyard of Horse Guards. And I used to take the ceremony, I used to love it. I used to love listening to the music, much more fun than working and watching the Horse Guards out of the window. And the preparations for Remembrance every year were building up to something very special. And Remembrance Sunday at the Cenotaph, I think, is one of the most magic ceremonies that I've seen anywhere around the world. It's quite understated. It's not millions of soldiers. It's kept quite tight. And there's this feeling that everybody comes together just to reflect and think in a very solemn way. Again, it's not triumphalist. It's not about celebrating victory. It's about thinking about commitment and dedication. And the moment, there are a number of spine-tingling moments every year at at Remembrance. I took my children when I had an office right over the cenotaph. I took them all in one year, and they stood there and watched and just felt the quiet of the 2-minute silence and felt the music and felt the sense of Achdus. There's a sense of unity in the crowd that I don't think they will ever forget, that feeling. So there are a number of spine-tingling moments, but for me, the most powerful every year is when they start the standard repertoire. There's a little repertoire of music that's done at the wreath laying, and the first is always Nimrod. It's from Elgar's Enigma Variations. It's Nimrod as set for a brass band, which is very different to how you hear it if it's played by an orchestra. And I've asked Joel, who's very, very kindly organized the music for this evening, very grateful to him. I've asked him to play the version that you find from the cenotaph. So you start with this, the massed bands being called to order, and then we go into this amazingly somber piece of dedication and reflection. So we're going to start with Nimrod.
Okay, so you said you had an office in Whitehall. How did you get from when you started being a lawyer, how did you become the sort of lawyer that doesn't just implement the law or interpret the law, but actually writes the law? How did you become that sort of a lawyer? And tell us what you did when you were doing that, why you were in Whitehall.
I went into public sector law, public service law very early on, about as early as I possibly could have done. Halfway through my pupillage, I decided I probably wasn't going to be able to cut it at the private bar. And I think later events have shown me that that was probably a very wise decision. I decided to retreat to the public sector and instantly entered the kind of nurturing environment that public sector law was then, and still to a large extent is now, to a very large extent now. I was surrounded by colleagues who were determined to make the best of me, and many of whom were very skilled at drawing out the best from young lawyers. So it was a brilliant decision on my part, even if partly inspired by cowardice. It turned out to be one of the most sensible decisions I ever made. And I started off in something that was then called the Lord Chancellor's Department, which was a tiny little office, and we ran the law, and lawyers ran the law. We were pretty much in charge of the legal system. And as a young lawyer, you got responsibility very early on. You were encouraged to think. You were encouraged not just to look for a precedent to copy out for some aviation contract or something. You were encouraged to think about the policy of the law, which was enormously exciting. Here I was, a couple of years out of university, and I was being encouraged to think about what the purpose of compensation law is, what the purpose of the of allowing or not allowing class actions to be brought by lots of people against large commercial monopolies. And you just got to think a lot. So I did that. I thought there for about 3 years, and then I had an opportunity to move to the Office of Parliamentary Counsel, which was an office based on Whitehall, where we wrote all the Acts of Parliament for every department. And it was extraordinarily varied work. It was quite pressurized for the public service, again, by escaping from the city or the bar. I'd chosen a relatively quiet life, but within Parliamentary Counsel, it was relatively pressurized. And there again, I had an opportunity to do things that were enriching, fundamentally enriching, and there was a feeling that public service was and is a blessing and a privilege. I wrote the bills for implementing the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland, and that was something that I still look back on and think I possibly that was an opportunity to make a difference to large numbers of people's lives, and that is a phenomenal bracha. I gave a talk a couple of years ago. I gave a talk in Oxford to some lawyers from around the world, young lawyers from around the world, and they were all scribbling away when I was telling them about Northern Ireland, and I realized that I was basically I was talking history to them. As far as they were concerned, this was a sort of history book talking at them. And what I found particularly exciting was a number of them from America, but a number of them from Ireland. And the youngsters from Ireland were writing this down terribly excitingly. This is a strange time they'd never heard of. And I realized my colleagues and I at the time, we took them out of knowledge of what it's like to grow up in metropolis, have to be guarded on your way to school every morning. And they couldn't believe what I was telling them. It was history, it was fantasy. And I thought, Baruch Hashem, that was amazing that I had the opportunity to play a part in changing people's lives in that way. And since then, I've done democratization work in other places with very fragile rule of law. And the more fragile the rule of law becomes, the more privileged one feels to be able to do something to help to secure it, sometimes even to introduce it into other places. So it was instantly, I recognized it as where I ought to be. I instantly felt comfortable there. I felt cherished and nurtured there by fantastic managers who took me into, trained me all the way along. And it was and is, I think, one of the most satisfying areas of law to be in, public sector law, where you really can make a difference. And if you get things right, you can help people enormously.
Right,
you get them
huge
wrong,
privilege, yeah.
No.
I found this quote, you've stressed a very positive aspect of it here, which obviously has been a huge privilege, and as you say, a brocha. I found something which you said about if you're not one isn't so careful, where you said there is no such thing as a comma in legislation which does not cause misery to somebody. So obviously it's a huge responsibility to get it right, because you could, it could go the other way as well. Have you been involved in anything which didn't go quite as well?
Oh yeah, one of the first acts I wrote as the front legs of the pantomime horse. When Barnsley Council, we trained for about 8 years as the back legs of the pantomime horse, and we weren't allowed in the front until we'd done about 8 years. And after 8 years, you were suddenly told, right, you're now counsel, you're now the front legs of the pantomime horse. And of course, that was a very panic-inducing moment, because you'd not driven, you'd always had somebody to rely on, and suddenly there was nobody. You now had back legs who were relying on you, and there was no one to tell you how to get it right. And I wrote an act. I wrote an act called the Enterprise Act, which amended quite an important part of the Insolvency Act, something quite important in insolvency legislation. And I did it very, very badly, because I was just in a state of panic the whole time. And as a result, that's one of my acts that comes to court all the time. It is regularly being Schedule B1 to the Insolvency Act is regularly being litigated in court, because it was my first attempt as the front legs of the pantomime horse, and it's not very good. Right. Now, there are other acts which nobody's ever heard of, because I got them right, so they don't come to court, and they just did what they wanted to do.
Okay, so it's something of a relief after all these words and talking and legislation. The Sound of Silence from Simon and Garfunkel. Yeah. What was the, yeah?
Yeah, it's rather a good tune, and they're rather good singers, and I think that they're a phenomenal duo. I've always enjoyed listening to them, and I suppose silence is a precious commodity these days.
Hello, darkness, my old friend. I've come to talk with you again, because a vision softly creeping left its seeds while I was sleeping, and the vision that was planted in my brain still remains within the sound of silence. In restless dreams I walked alone, narrow streets of cobblestone, neath the halo of a street lamp. I turned my collar to the cold and damp, when my eyes were stabbed by the flash of a neon light. Split the night and touch the sound of silence, and in the naked light I saw 10,000 people, maybe more, people talking without speaking, people hearing without listening, people writing songs that voices never share. No one did disturb the sound of silence.
Okay, you're very obviously an Orthodox Jew and you wear a couple at work. Has this ever been an issue? Has it been an issue in terms of discrimination, or if you've been traveling abroad, people were surprised when you turned up that this was who you were? Or, well, tell us about that bit first. Has it ever been an issue?
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, in getting on for 35 years in the public service, I have definitely encountered anti-Semitism on quite a number of occasions, but as you would expect, almost always from Jews. It's very rare to encounter anti-Semitism from non-Jews. They don't really need to have a go at us because we do such a good job of fighting ourselves. On 3 occasions, walking through the corridors of the House of Lords, have I been told it's not appropriate to wear a kippah in the House of Lords. And of course, each time it was a Jewish peer. no surprise. Non-Jewish people would look at you, they're fine if he wants to wear a kippah, why shouldn't he? It's only we who would quarrel with it. One of them said to me, we don't do that here. It's ostentatious. It's not necessary. So I said to him, fine, okay, I hear what you say. I've noted your complaint. I will report it to the Attorney General and the Clerk of Parliament. So I take it that you will report it to your... And he said, no, you don't need to do that. I was only joking. And he bashed off down the corridors. You couldn't see him for dust. And one of my Christian colleagues turned to me and said, it's funny. He said, I never get the bishops coming up to me and saying, I'm just joking by telling you shouldn't wear a cross or something like that. We aren't very good in how we treat each other in public. And there were 1 or 2 times where there were Jewish politicians or Jewish members of the establishment who I felt actually had a bit of a reason to be a bit uncomfortable around Orthodox Jews. 2 I can think of in particular. One was a very senior judge, and one was a very senior politician. And they both, I knew, felt they had been treated very badly by the community when they married out. And they both clearly felt very bruised by their treatment. And I clearly represented a community in their eyes that had not been very sensitive or pleasant to them. And I suppose it was fair enough that they would feel uncomfortable around me. And I felt the best I could do was sort of grin and bear it and show that at least I would react decently and behave decently and properly to them, and let them vent their frustration if that was how they felt they needed to do it. So I think, yes, that's been an issue. As to foreign places, very, very little. I was in Malaysia. I was in Malaysia on a couple of occasions, and one time when I was there, I was chatting with a colleague, and Malaysia is thought to be a very anti-Semitic country. At a political level, it certainly has a lot of antagonism to Israel. At a political level, at a personal level, I always found the people I met there to be very charming, very friendly. There was one occasion when I mentioned Israel, and I thought a cloud came across the colleague's brow, so I moved on to other things. And then 2 days later, she raised the topic. She said, "You mentioned Israel a couple of days ago," and I thought, "Oh dear, what's coming now?" She said, "Tell me about. I've always wanted to go there. Tell me about it." And we had a very charming conversation in Myanmar, which is so sad what's happened in Myanmar in the last few days. I was in Myanmar again, a few occasions physically, a couple of occasions physically, and many more occasions virtually. And they were delighted to see an Orthodox Jew there. They don't have a Jewish community there now, but they were the Attorney General of Myanmar. The first thing he said to me was Mr. Greenberg, you are among friends. We were the first country to recognize the state of Israel, and they're very proud of that.
Very nice. Very nice.
So,
Right. has there been a conflict of interest in terms of any laws which you've drafted between your sort of personal, I suppose one has to put it to one side, but a potential conflict in interest between your personal opinions or sort of religious outlook and laws that you've had to draft?
I mean, not very much. Again, part of the charm of the public service as a lawyer is you're quite protected from the things that I think young lawyers find particularly challenging. Sometimes I get young lawyers asking for advice about what they should do when they go into legal service, and they're worried about things like Shabbos and Kashrus, and I say to them, you don't need to worry about that at all. These days, everybody understands about those matters, and you don't need to worry at all about that. But I often say to them, I think you will have to worry about things like midvar sheketir, how to stay away from any dishonesty or any kind of falsehood. If you're a litigation lawyer, you can stay away from any kind of falsehood, but it may be quite challenging depending on where you are. And I try and steer them to parts of the commercial sector that I think that will be less challenging.
Right. Okay.
For us, sorry, I know I'm giving you longer
it's all right.
than you wanted, Vicki, but that's
it's fine.
The way it goes. But I will give one example. The only time I felt perturbed, seriously perturbed about a law that I was drafting, was in relation to banning hunting. Now, that might seem fairly strange because I don't go fox hunting myself terribly often,
Really?
and the ancestral Greenberg estates have never required much in the way of pest control and of that kind. So it didn't bother me personally, but it bothered me quite a lot that the moral judgment of the majority of the members of the House of Commons at that time was being forced onto the rest of the country, because that's not really what politicians are there for, and it's certainly not what they do best. And on the whole, law that tries to get ahead of the consensual morality of the country tends to fail. Law is good at shoring up and reflecting the moral consent, so that it isn't very good at taking people further than they've gone. And from a Jewish perspective, I mean, we very much value the aspect of a democracy which is about protecting and cherishing minorities, not despite there being minority views, but because they're minority views. And I did feel significantly uncomfortable in that whole process. I wasn't being asked to do something that I found repugnant personally, but I was being asked to do something that I thought the law should probably not get terribly involved in.
Right. In terms of cherishing minorities, did you work on the Equalities Act? Was that one of your?
I wrote the 2006 Equalities
Right.
Act.
Okay, with protected characteristics. So how did you choose? How did you choose what the protected characteristics were going to be?
Well, I mean, as always, I was told what to write. You always get you always get policy instructions. It was quite innovative. We took power to introduce protection for religion, but there was something I did on that with the protected characteristics that remains with me, and I talk to when I'm teaching about drafting. I talk about this to this day. There were a lot of groups who needed to see some words on the face of the act, things like dignity of the individual, worth of everybody, this, that, and the other. And the only problem about them was they don't mean anything. Right? They don't mean anything in legal terms or in sharp, clear terms. But when I say they needed to see them, I mean they needed to see them. Their constituent groups needed to feel that this legislation supported the language that they identified. So I brought them in and I said, okay, tell me all the words and phrases you want to see, and I will top them and tail them. I'll put something on top that will, if you like, draw the sting out of them. So I said, in exercising their functions under this act, public authorities must have regard to the desirability of creating a world in which, and then I said, now dictate, and I can put down worth of the individual, sensitivity, people reaching their potential, all that sort of thing. And the result was an act that I think did resonate correctly with the different kinds of people who needed to feel ownership of it. So that was quite exciting. And like I told you, there were plenty of times, and still are plenty of times, when I reckon I get things wrong, often quite disastrously wrong. This was a time when I thought, yeah, that was actually quite a good idea, and it worked quite well.
Okay, very good. The next piece of music gave me quite a surprise, as we've been talking about you being an Orthodox Jew. Abide With Me is not an obvious choice. Would you like to share with us why you chose that?
Yeah, I think it's very common to talk about interfaith these days, and I don't think interfaith. A lot of interfaith sort of, let's debate this and discuss this, and you have a Lutker and I'll have something else. I'm not sure it really personally doesn't do a lot for me. What I mean by interfaith is looking over the fence, as it were, and finding aspects of other religions, poetry, literature, culture, that I find impressive and I think we can learn from. And obviously there's Talmudic support for that idea. Now, I think church music, they have some advantages over us. We can't use church organ in our Shabbos services. We can't have mixed choirs, at least not in the Orthodox shuls. There are lots of ways in which we're therefore slightly hampered. And church music, I think some of it is absolutely amazingly spiritually powerful. And this rendition by the King's College Choir in Cambridge of Abide With Me, I think is spiritually powerful. And I think much as we acquire music, there's no Jewish music because there's no such thing. We've acquired music from around us wherever we've been. And this is something where I sit back and I feel that there's something we can learn from the spiritual purity and refinement of this particular hymn, much of which matches words that we use in our own hymnology. There's bits of Adon Olam in it as well. But just the delivery is, I think, unsurpassed.
Law, over the last few years, people have exhibited a much greater interest in law in the public space. So, for example, all the Brexit shenanigans and the Supreme Court and Parliament and prorogation, and who even knew what that meant before, and all that kind of thing. And now with coronavirus, with the lockdown and whether these restrictions are lawful or not lawful, and freedom and all this kind of thing. Is that something, I'm looking at it, I'm thinking, gosh, no one ever was so interested in it all before. Is that something, have there been other times, do you think, when the circumstances have promoted a huge public interest in the technicalities of law? And do you think that's a good thing, not a good thing? Something to be encouraged?
No, you're right, Vicky. It's always been it's always been a symbol of a very disruptive time of great fragility in the rule of law. So if you go back to the Great Reform Bill, when people are talking about the technicalities of amendments in the House of Commons in the pub, there's actually something wrong. The rule of law works at its best when it's just being left to carry on and nobody's getting too excited about it. And I think coronavirus, one of the long-term casualties, if we're not very careful, and so far there don't seem to be many signs of our being very careful, I think one of the long-term casualties is going to be respect for the rule of law in this country. And I will explain why I say that. The complexity of the law, the confusion between what's regulations, what's guidance, is it statutory guidance, do I have to follow it? The confusion has had an extraordinary result. There are millions of people, and I mean millions of people in this country, who have knowingly and deliberately broken law for the first time in their lives in the last year. They've made decisions and they've said, well, I know it shouldn't do that, but you know what? If this person can do that, if they can do that, if this person can do that, and that's a very, very dangerous line to cross. Once law-abiding people have become habituated to the idea that, well, we can't keep all law because there's too much of it, nobody understands it, even the politicians don't understand it, and they break it when they want to. There's no easy way back to a complete and universal respect for the rule of law. Let's not forget, 3 or 4 weeks ago, whatever it was, we came within half an hour of America becoming a former democracy. There was about half an hour and a technical question of to whom the guards of the Capitol report, whether they report to the government of the day or to some other power. Those, by half an hour and one reporting line, we just held on to the largest democracy in the world. Rule of law is incredibly fragile. And I think it's fantastic that we take it for granted. And as I say to you, the time when we don't think about it, it's working at its best. Baruch Hashem, we've all grown up in what we call a Malchus Shel Chesed. Now, some people think that means it's a kingdom that's nice to the Jews. That, to me, is not the definition of a Malchus Shel Chesed. A Malchus Shel Chesed is a kingdom that's nice to itself, that's nice to all of its people, that where there is respect and sensitivity based on the rule of law. And it's fantastic that we take it for granted, but it's also very dangerous that we take it for granted because it can be changed, it can be broken like that. And once it's been broken, it is virtually impossible to re-establish it as it was before. So I think we're living in difficult times in the United Kingdom. I think respect for politics is low, respect for politicians is low, respect for law is low, respect for lawyers is low, and the potential damage, the potential victim of that, if you like, is all the people who rely on the rule of law without even knowing that it exists. So I think these have been difficult times. I think there are a number of things that we can do to try to re-establish fundamental principles of rule of law in a way that makes them more robust. And I think that is the next and most urgent job for lawyers in the public service.
What would you say is an example of that?
The biggest example, I think, is just this confusion between guidance and rules and regulations. As you say, Vicky, once people are talking about it, it's important that they should know what they're talking about.
Right.
And with the best will in the world, people who want to know the difference are finding it impossible to tell the difference. So I think there needs to be, and I am involved in a couple of little ideas that I hope will help in this sense. It's about bringing people back to being able to understand what is legally required and what is discretionary, and then hopefully re-establish the idea, if it says don't step on the grass, we don't step on the grass. And yet millions of people in this country are by nature law-abiding people who love the law. And I think they are as disturbed as anybody else by the fact that they have been driven to not even knowing whether they're keeping the law or not by the complexity and confusion of the law that has arisen out of the emergency.
I think you're right, because I think looking at some of the questions, Adam Wagner answers these questions on Twitter. And when you look at some of the questions and the levels of detail which people are asking him, and they're actually genuinely worried, they don't want to do something which is going to be illegal, even though it's not going to damage anybody else or cause any harm and that kind of thing. People are genuinely concerned, I'm not going to do it, even if it's difficult for me, because it's illegal. So I think there is still a respect for the law. But as you say, it's yes, a lack of respect for lawyers and government and politicians, but hopefully still a general respect for the law. Okay, moving from Abide With Me to something a bit more Jewish, we've got Ms. Molodovit. Do you want to tell us why you chose Ms. Molodovit and why you chose this one?
Yeah, I mean, it's not much more Jewish. It's a Hasidic melody, but it's a particular favorite. It's because it's a Modjitz melody, arranged by the fantastic late lamented Ben Zion Schenker, and in this case performed by a fantastic combination. There's Itzhak Perlman, the violinist, and there's probably the best, the most inspiring chazan in the world today, Yitzchak Meir Helfgott, and they're performing Mizmor LeDavid, and it is just sublime.
Hashem roi lo yechzor bino is deshe yar bitzeini al mei menucho es yenaleni nafshi yeshoy Hashem
Okay, in the New Year's Honours list, you were appointed a Companion of the Order of the Bath. What does that entail? They've gone past the days where they actually involve bathing people. What does it entail these days?
So it's an order of chivalry that was disbanded in the 1300s and was then revived in the I think around the 1600s. The bath referred to is actually a little bit like our mikveh. It is something that the knights errant dedicated themselves by going to a kind of ritual bath before they went into battle. So it's a peculiarly resonates with us in terms of Tumah and Taro in its origins. Today, it's the order that is kept for public service, civil and military. It's got two branches, the civil service and the military service. It does come with some significant perks.
I saw you can get married in Westminster Abbey, and your children
can get
should they
married.
want to.
Your children can get married in Westminster Abbey. One of my colleagues who was made a CB a few years ago, his daughter did get married in the Abbey. It's in a chapel at the side, but you get to go up the front in the front way.
Very cool.
It's all very nice, and it's like all these things, it's a great testament to the generosity of spirit of one's colleagues, and it really brings us neatly full circle. Vicky, I said the public service is a place where people are cherished and nurtured, and then later on you find yourself surrounded by very generous spirited colleagues, and I was very touched by that generosity of spirit that I felt throughout my career in the public service, and this I thought was just a particularly striking instance of it. So it was a great pleasure for that reason.
And is there, I know there isn't at the moment, but will there be some kind of installation ceremony? Have you got the medal? Or
no, there'll be, Mirz Hashem, there will be an investiture in
right.
due course, and then you get the medal, the same as for other. Right,
and you can go to Buckingham Palace and hopefully meet the Queen, or
that's the idea. How many more she will feel able to do herself, I don't know, but it would be very nice. We'll see.
Right. Okay.
When I was called to the bar, I was the last year that Lord Denning came himself and assisted at the call to the bar, and that people at the time felt that was a very historic occasion, and people were very. It was quite emotional. So it would be nice. I don't suppose the Queen will be doing many investitures, and if I manage to get to one of her last, that would be a great pleasure. If not, it will also.
It's a very significant honour. It's a credit to you, and I think it reflects on the Jewish community as well. As a a known member of the Jewish community, they were able to carry out this amount of public service and be acknowledged in this way. And I think it's a good place to not to end your career, but it's a good place to end this evening, and to say thank you very much for joining us, and thank you to everyone else who's joined us. And to conclude with a sort of festive piece of music, the Emperor Concerto from Beethoven. I think we're going to hear just something from the very end. Christian Zimmermann, conducted by Leonard Bernstein. Would you like to share with us why you chose this? And then Joel will play that, and we'll say goodnight to everybody.
Well, thank you, Vicky, for arranging and running this evening. Thank you, Joel, again for making the arrangements, and thank you everybody for coming. It's always such a pleasure to share any occasion with the shul where I grew up, and to have the great pleasure of sharing it with my parents as well. So thank you very much. I've chosen the Emperor Concerto. Someone told me many years ago, Mozart had occasional glimpses of the infinite, Beethoven lived in it, and it's absolutely right, there's no question. And Rabbi Cooper, Zeichet Tzadik Livrocha, who had a great influence on me, he was a great Baal Yashrus, he was a very important influence for that reason. And he told me that Rosh Hashanah morning, when he was preparing for preparing his mind for Hamelech, he would very often clear his mind and think of some of the more the more pomp-based and awe-inspiring aspects of the Emperor Concerto. And that again takes us right back to where we started. Solemnity, dignity, and what I remember of Dunstan Road when I was a child.
Thank you.
What if you could?
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Good night, everybody. Good night.